Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. So, and now without further ado, I would like to present Sahra Kress, sorry. Sahra has a long-term interest in complexity theory and how everything fits together. She divides her time between a career as a midwife in the Kapiti coast and re-localization, restoration efforts, and Degrowth advocacy. So please, kia ora, Sahra. The room is yours.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jose. And ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. Greetings, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight. We're really delighted to have the opportunity to discuss degrowth and how it relates to climate change. Jack and I have put together a presentation for you, but we're really going to make an effort to try and keep it very succinct and brief, because we are most interested in the discussion time and having some opportunity for dialogue and engagement with all of you. So as Jose mentioned, I am the coordinator of DANS, Degrowth Aotearoa New Zealand, and do my best to raise awareness about degrowth. And last year I had a great time organizing a national conference on degrowth, really looking at the macro and micro aspects of degrowth. But I also just want to mention that I am a midwife, and I mention that for two reasons. One being that I was at a birth yesterday, and so if I'm a little bit washed out tonight, it's because I've been dealing with a very, very complex labor and just pulling myself through some very busy times. But as such, as a midwife, it relates to degrowth because I am working with babies and mothers, and so with every birth that I attend, I'm really aware of the future of that child, and I feel very concerned. And I suppose the other reason that it relates to degrowth is because in obstetrics and the medical world, we have an enormous focus on risk management. And in the medicalization of birth, you know, we are very, very restricted, and there's an enormous emphasis on risk. And I find that ironic when I look at the future and I see so little preparedness for the long-term outcome of the children who are being born now, and the risk management about ensuring that they have a safe future. So I'm just wondering about our slides. Is it possible to screen share, Jack, to go to our first slide?
Do you not see the opening slide?
No, I still have just the, I think the screen share hasn't gone through yet. So I'll just keep talking while we're sorting out.
Marlena, can you organize the screen share?
We've organized the presentation into two different sort of sections. I will start the presentation and just give a very brief overview of the sort of setting the scene and talking about climate change and the enormity of the challenge that we're facing. And here we are. And then Jack will take over and talk about our approach from a degrowth perspective to addressing climate change. So yeah, perhaps if we have a full, can you make your slideshow a full screen, Jack?
That's what I'm trying to do. Just bear with me a moment.
It's all right.
Kia ora, Sahra. It's Louise here.
Kia ora.
I'm screen sharing my screen just to help out. And
Yep.
Okay, Jack, would you like to do the screen share?
I've just requested control of the screen from Louise. Okay. And now I should be able to.
Why don't you give it back to Louise?
So while Jack is sorting that, I'll just continue here. So as I mentioned, my part of this presentation is a brief review, really setting the scene and a reminder of the main points that many of you will be familiar with. And climate change is absolutely an existential threat. And we see the impacts around the world and increasing. And there are multiple climate tipping points looming, as we know. Climate change is caused by ecological overshoot from too many people placing too many demands on natural systems. Biodiversity loss, pollution, and inequality are all consequences of overshoot. Next slide, Jack. So just a reminder of planetary boundaries. Climate change is only one boundary. And I find this in a really important graph to return to, because as you can see there on the upper left-hand side, climate change is not actually even as bad as some of the other boundaries that are being overshot currently. So the reality is that we are crossing multiple boundaries, and continued overshoot will lead to complete breakdown and collapse of life support systems. Next slide, Jack. Yes, and the tragedy is that things are getting worse fast. As you can see in these graphs over short periods, the magnitude and speed of increasing overshoot is very significant. Next slide. And actually, addressing overshoot deals with climate, biodiversity, and pollution risks simultaneously. And these threats can only be effectively met by degrowth, which is a reduction of energy and demands on natural sources and sinks. Next slide. So
Jack,
this is a graph.
Use the view, top left, Jack, view. Select them there.
There's nothing in there in the top left for me on my screen.
So this is a graph indicating how far we are from nature's carrying capacity. And climate threats require that we address overpollution as well as overconsumption, and risk management and preparation for radically different ways of living must be the priority. Next slide. So the magnitude of overshoot has three features. The scope is global. The scale requires a 70 to 80% reduction of consumption and pollution. And the speed of disruption is rapidly approaching irreversible and serious tipping points. Next slide. So, yes, my final major and critical point is that mainstream solutions will make overshoot worse. More extraction, mining, and harm from simply shifting problems, as you can see in this image. Surely our collective imagination and responsible planning can do better. All right, over to you, Jack.
Okay, for those of you who may not be familiar with degrowth, the primary goal of degrowth is restoring and preserving the biosphere. It recognizes that we have the only biosphere we're aware of in the universe. So it's a pretty special place. And as Sahra's indicated, we're destroying its basic functions, its ability to regenerate and to manage its waste. The degrowth movement is very broad, and I won't go into any details other than to say that there's an ecological focus, there's a social focus, and there's a economic, political focus. Our particular approach is to focus on the ecological, because we see that as fundamental, and that if we don't get that right, nothing else really matters. Now, I'm just going to go to the next slide here. So there are three basic goals to the degrowth movement. As Sarah's mentioned, it's the managed reduction of material throughput. And that's about extracting materials, raw materials from nature, using it in our economy, and extruding it as waste. That's what throughput's about. And we're way beyond carrying capacity at this point. We cannot continue to support the current human population in the way that we are for very much longer. So reducing material throughput is the key focus of degrowth. We realize that's going to be incredibly disruptive, because we're used to consuming more and more and more every year. Not only our material footprint is some 100 billion tons of natural resources a year now, and continuing to rise. So reducing that throughput is going to be very disruptive. That's acknowledged, but it will be less disruptive than ignoring it and letting the entire system collapse. And the third focus, the sort of economic and political policy orientation, is to create systemic change to support a transition to a steady, what's called a steady state economy. That's one in balance with nature's ability to regenerate and to absorb waste. So degrowth is about focusing on what is necessary. So much of our discussions of climate change and other environmental challenges is about what's politically feasible, which is understandable. I mean, we're dealing with the real world, but we sometimes lose sight of what is absolutely necessary from a biophysical perspective, of what the basic laws of nature tell us we're doing to the planet, and what's required to reverse that disruption and damage. So the degrowth is very much about focusing on what's necessary and trying to close that gap between what's necessary and what's considered politically feasible. As Sahra's mentioned, there's many false solutions to the climate crisis. There's the green growth approach, which is the dominant one, that we're going to electrify everything and continue as we are. So electric vehicles, photovoltaic panels, wind turbines, nuclear fusion, hydrogen transport, biofuels, etc., are all, I mean, if you pay attention to the news and technology at all, you'll know that these things are developing at a rapid rate. There's many reports about how much less expensive they're becoming and all kinds of breakthroughs. But the only truly green growth is the growth of biomass. All of these other things require physical infrastructures that require mining, and mining requires fossil energy. So it can't possibly meet the requirement of not only reducing fossil fuel emissions, but of reducing overall throughput in our economy. Another solution that's often talked about is a circular economy, where things are reused and recycled or repurposed, all of which are good things to be doing, and we should have been doing for decades. But the fact is that the increased efficiencies or reductions in throughput that come from these types of technical initiatives are minuscule compared to the 70 or 80% reduction that Sahra talked about. So it alone is far from sufficient to take us where we need to go, again, especially given the time urgency of making these reductions before irreversible ecosystem changes occur. And the circular economy relies a lot on decoupling, the idea that we can somehow separate material throughput, actually using natural resources, from disrupting ecosystems. But the fact is that the more energy we use, the more ecosystem disruption we do. So actually having more cheap, abundant energy, regardless of what its source, is going to continue to be very disruptive. And none of the decoupling issues and experiments that have been going on for 20 or 30 years, this is not a new idea, have really made, none of these initiatives have made the kind of contributions that's necessary to reduce 70 or 80% of our throughput in the time that we've got left. So here are some degrowth policies. We see as a critical one, rationing fossil fuels. Attempting to control our behavior by increasing prices, such as with the current emissions trading scheme or the carbon tax approach, we see as flawed for a variety of reasons. One is that it doesn't really control the quantity of materials directly. It relies on people responding to increased cost. Rationing would actually control the quantity and therefore guarantee actual reductions in emissions. And a methodology worked out by a British economist, they're called tradable energy quotas, which are a way of managing the rationing process so that there are declining quotas available over, say, a decade. And at the end, there's little or no continued use of fossil fuels at all. We can talk more about that, but that's the basic approach. And it's a very fair one because it doesn't increase the cost of fossil fuels, which would be very unfair to those that can't afford it. And it would really allow rationing by wealth rather than by quantity, which is not an effective way of doing it. Some other degrowth policies, and there's many, but which I won't go into, but just to give you a general flavor, the idea of basic, universal basic services, so that housing, healthcare, education would be freely available, paid for by the government, to help with the disruption that would occur from a reduction in energy production. And an often ignored issue in this whole process, whether it's climate or other environmental issues, and certainly it's important in terms of reducing throughput, is balancing population size with resources. Given that the Earth is finite and we have limited resources, we need to share them equitably, and everyone needs access to meeting their own basic needs. And the more people we have, the less per capita resources we can use. So we have to strike the right balance between the two. So again, there are many other policies and programs that the degrowth movement discusses, which I won't go into, but simply to be aware that there's a growing literature, academic literature on these topics and easily available. To bring it more into the discussion of climate change and how the two relate, well, there's a number of degrowth initiatives that would reduce emissions. Rationing fossil fuels, again, provides certainty that emissions would decline. It would reduce, for example, also the number of electric vehicles that could be made because they require fossil energy in their production. So rather than attempting to replace cars and private vehicles by electrification, the idea of the 20-minute city, where we redesign our cities so that live, work, and play can all be accessed within a 20-minute active transport area. So the idea is to reduce the demand for transporting either people or goods rather than electrifying the transport of people and goods. Localization is another major theme in the degrowth literature. If we're not moving around as much and not moving goods around as much, we have to rely more on local resources and our local infrastructure. So localization is an important part. And simplifying technologies. Rather than relying on energy-driven technologies, we're likely to rely more on mechanical and human and animal labor as we did before the fossil fuel era. So by minimizing demands on nature with less stuff, again, Sarah made this point, but I think it's worth repeating. We think of reducing the pollution associated with climate change, but the way we need to do that is reduce the consumption that causes the pollution. So it's not just the use of fossil energy, but we're using fossil energy to consume a lot of things. So both have to go together. Degrowth it also has an impact on adaptation and can increase adaptation to climate change and other ecosystem disruptions. By focusing on community resilience at the community level, again, the relocalization, and focusing on basic human needs. These we take for granted at a developed country like New Zealand. You know, we assume our food's going to be available, we assume shelter is going to be available and so on. But for those that were affected in New Zealand by the storms in the North Island, those basic needs suddenly became very relevant, especially when the disaster management infrastructure was inadequate to manage it. People had to manage on their own at the local community level. And planning for that, planning to how to adapt is a major initiatives that DANS is taking, for example, the organization that Sahra and I are part of. It also emphasizes local control of essential services. Think of food, for example. What if, you know, there's a disaster in your community and you don't have access to supermarkets any longer? Well, do you really want corporations to be controlling your food supply in that condition, in that situation? Or would you be better off to have local control of that essential service? And the same applies to others. I mean, many of these corporations had windfall profits, you know, during the pandemic, and that could be exacerbated, you know, with continuing adverse events. So the importance of essential control, of local control of essential services is really important. And any activities that build community connections between people, because that's ultimately what it's about. It's about the relationships we have with others in our community that are going to determine how well we fare when those adverse events occur, which we know they will. And the other important thing is making local decisions, not letting some distant government that doesn't understand local needs and resources and situations. So building community, building ways that people can assess the risks that they're facing that are unique to their community.
On farmland can increase productivity
and to be able to have local control of all of those essential services is very important and very important part of degrowth. Degrowth recognizes that we have a very uncertain future ahead of us. And I think many of us recognize this in terms of the kind of anxiety there is about climate and a range of other issues. Climate's only one of the disruptors. We're seeing ecosystem collapse and biodiversity loss. We're seeing more and more pollution, not only of our exterior environment, but of our own bodies. You know, the more and more pollutants are being found in human cells and tissue. Increasing conflict and violence over resources. We're seeing that. I mean, both the Ukraine and Gaza, while there's many other aspects to it, to both of those conflicts, both involve considerable resources as well. we've seen supply chain disruptions, and being where we're located at the bottom of the Pacific, we're at the end of everyone's supply chain, and we have a small population, so we're not an important destination for goods. So if there's disruptions elsewhere, we're going to be affected. And the economic system, of course, is the most rapidly changing one, and the one that could be disrupted quickly and most suddenly. And next, but there are a few certainties that we can rely on, and one is the unfortunate certainty of adverse events occurring more frequently and with greater severity. We can also be very certain that basic human needs will be threatened for more people as these adverse events occur. We can also be certain that these basic needs will remain relevant. So things that we now take for granted, we have to pay more attention to in terms of ensuring that we have local control and that we can continue to meet those needs when disasters occur. And as I mentioned before, the degrowth movement tries to focus on what's necessary as opposed to what's feasible. And while there's a whole range of policies and programs, we recognize that the likelihood of many of these being adopted is very low. So the importance of community initiatives is something that we feel very strongly about, and where we are intending to put our efforts in terms of providing supports to communities who want to take up this initiative and try to build the resilience to ensure basic needs can be met, regardless of what kinds of adverse events occur, whether it's for climate or whatever. So that's the end of the presentation. There's our website. There's quite a bit of information on there about various aspects of the degrowth movement. Again, we've covered things very, very briefly and just some highlights. So if the concept of degrowth is new to you, here's an opportunity to discuss it, ask questions, and try to get some clarifications about what it is and what it isn't. So Jose, if you want to invite people to.
Thank you, Jack. For those who doesn't know Jack, Jack Santa Barbara is a retired psychologist, is a CEO and academic, and has been involved with a variety of environmental and social justice NGOs at the national and international level. So thank you, Jack, for the wonderful presentation. So please, if you want to make any question, you have your digital raise hand, and put your hand up, and then one of our speakers will answer your questions. Just remember to be a little bit brief because we want to give time to everybody. So please, let's ask our speakers. Anybody there? Meanwhile, everybody think of their questions. Jack, I have a question for you, or for Sahra. It seems that the growth that is such a logical and natural and elegant approach to the polycrisis that we are in, do you know why it's not more spoken, it's not more accepted? It seems nearly like a dirty word in our economic and political world. Do you know why there is this rejection of the growth?
Sahra, go ahead.
Any of you?
Well, yeah, I'll give my brief answer and then Jack can comment as well. I think that, the way that I see it is that sort of economic growth is almost like a religion. It's this idea that we need more and more, and that everything good comes from economic growth. And so when you have a movement that is seriously questioning that, people feel frightened and often misunderstand and think that it means, when we talk about degrowth, that we're advocating for recession. And so it's understandable that people would be concerned about that. And of course, what we're talking about is a very carefully planned reduction, and looking at, equity and everyone's needs being met. So it's an issue of redistribution and allocation. And what we have in society currently is an absolutely gross inequality and wealth going to a very, very small number of people. And of course, those people also having enormous control of politics and the media and, the power structures that we have. So there's a lot of lobbying that goes into government, and this idea that we have to continue to grow is very embedded in people's awareness and consciousness. So I think it's largely a misunderstanding. I think that really when we talk about the concept of sufficiency, which is really key to degrowth, we're talking about everyone's basic needs being met so they can have enough to perhaps have adequate shelter, and therefore there's policies in degrowth that talk about a reduced working week, so there's more time for community initiatives, more time for relationships, more time for local endeavors. And there's a lot of benefits that come once you really understand that the true satisfaction in life is often in the immaterial. So it's the relationships, the time, the purpose in life, the quality, not quantity. So I think I think that's why we work so hard to try and help people understand that this is something that's really beneficial. And also, crisis preparedness. It may not be the luxury that people want, but it may be a matter of survival. Jack?
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
I think we have a question from.
Can I just add something to that, Jose?
Yes, please. Yes.
Before we give Paul's question. Yeah, I totally agree with what Sarah's said. Just to add that we have to appreciate that we've all been brainwashed by the marketing and advertising industry for the last century. It's largely been evolving and developing, actually has been supported by governments because it adds to economic growth and wealth and power and influence. And the global advertising and marketing budget, annual budget today, is around $1 trillion. Yeah, $1 trillion is what we're up against in terms of the influence that kind of very sophisticated marketing and advertising has to make us buy stuff. And we've all enjoyed stuff. I mean, let's face it, it's fun. It's nice to have stuff, and do things and fly everywhere. And it's magic. But it's also incredibly destructive, and it's hard to dissociate those two. But as Sarah's mentioned as well, the things that really matter, the data about happiness and general life satisfaction is very clear. Once you have the basic needs met, you've got the basic material needs met. It's the relationships, it's the non-material things. It's having leisure time with friends and family to pursue, hobbies and personal interests, and doing things that are meaningful, and connect with your neighbors. I mean, those are the things that really give us long-term life satisfaction. And those things have been pushed aside and considered irrelevant because they're not part of the sexy marketing, environment that we've all been seduced by. So I think, there's lots of reasons why it's a hard sell. It's going against our very culture. all of our institutions are built around growth. Our very money system would collapse if we didn't have growth. So it's pretty fun, pretty big beast we're coming up against.
Thank you, Jack. Paul, please.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I very much have liked the presentation so far. I think it's you've put everything very well. There's an area that seems to be quite neglected. There's the fertility of our soils, and we're totally dependent on phosphate from Western Sahara. Now we mined out Nauru, and the nitrogen fertilizer, which depends on relatively cheap fossil fuels. So, and that's going to end very shortly. And so, a couple of 100 years ago, we fertilized our market gardens and farms with human and animal manure. But at the present time, we regard that as something to be discarded and got rid of safely. But how are we going to transition? All councils are still trying to deal with the human waste and get rid of it. How are we going to transition to utilizing that in a proper manner? It's much easier to deal with it on a smaller quantity with things like compost toilets. Clevis Moultram is one of the best designs, but that means retrofitting houses. If you build a new house, of course, you can fit it in within the structure, but no councils are promoting that. Wellington City Council did promote that about 15, 20 years ago with Celia Wade Brown. We had a demonstration toilet by the Polytechnic, but that seems to have disappeared completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, just a quick response, Paul, and then I'll let Jack take over as well. I mean, as you know, I am so overwhelmed by all the infrastructure problems that we have in Wellington, and things are so complex now that it is very difficult to manage, and there's not enough investment from the government, and we all struggle with that. And we also know that fossil fuels are needed for fertilizer and cement and steel and plastics, and so once we're using less fossil fuel, once it's more difficult to access, all of those pillars of civilization are going to be threatened. And so we really have to be very smart, I think, about preparing for a reality that's going to mean simpler infrastructure. And as people who know me, I'm very, very passionate about tiny houses because they're affordable, they're movable, so they're great for earthquake preparedness, they're great for issues around flooding. You don't have to have the land ownership stuff, which has mortgages associated, which locks people into needing income. And of course, the services with composting and solar are so much simpler to manage. So, there are great case study examples like that I think are ways that we can demonstrate degrowth living and the kind of simplicity that is both very sensible and affordable, but also manageable in terms of servicing and organizing.
Thank you. We have Meg.
Can I add something to that, Jose? Again, coming back to the 20-minute city idea, I think is relevant here. Because one way of thinking about the 20-minute city structure, where there's live, work, play all within the active transport radius. The play part of that involves access to nature. So urban forests, as well as urban gardens, need to be considered as part of what our lives are like. And if you think of breaking a city up into a series of villages, traditional villages, where most people lived for most of humanity, and which survived changes in empire because they're the most stable kind of human settlement, then we could probably make more constructive use of human waste, because there's lots of nutrients there that we're just wasting. In addition to spending, my understanding is most municipalities spend about a third of their energy on moving water. That much, a third of their energy, under municipal control. I don't mean the whole population, but under municipal control, it's just moving water in and out of buildings, and moving waste, and using potable drinking water quality for waste removal. It's a silly system, but we're able to do it because we had fossil energy. And that's what overshoot is about. You get an unusual abundance of some resource that allows you to do all kinds of things that you would like to do, but then when that resource isn't available anymore, you're in trouble if you don't have backup plans. So 20-minute city again, villages within cities using human waste to recycle for continued nutrition is probably a way forward that's going to happen whether we plan it or not. So better to plan it, I suggest. You're on mute, Jose. I think you want to invite Meg.
Sorry, yes, Meg, it's your time. If you can unmute yourself, like myself. Hello, Meg. Meg, are you with us? Okay. Well, yes.
Oh, right. Sorry, I was having a lot of difficulty unmuting myself. Okay, I have just last half hour returned from Sydney. It's an extraordinarily affluent existence that confronts you, and I lived there for a very long time. I talk to people about a lot of these ideas, and they absolutely can see merit, but they are locked into a system which keeps them doing what they're doing. This whole, real estate game. It just locks people in. So where are our efforts best put to really move this idea? Is it just at the very community level and do these very simple things whereby we are connecting? How do we progress this idea more quickly is really, how do we go about it?
All of the above, Meg, and huge full sympathy. We are struggling with exactly the same question. It's so frustrating when things are so urgent and we're so concerned and we need drastic change, and most people are either unaware or so busy with just meeting their own, cost of living and, personal struggles, or want to change, but the structures mean that it's almost impossible to do anything different than conform. So I think, we're very, very clear that ultimately, it's going to be systemic, and it has to come from the top to enable sort of the systems to be supportive of the types of change and the scale of change that's needed. But as you know, politically, we're going backwards in this country. And so we've kind of pivoted to, doing what we can at the community level, hoping that enough people and enough influential people will start to, get the picture, and that the population will ultimately push the leaders. Jack?
Yeah, Meg, what you were doing and just raising the issue and talking about it, asking questions about it, I think is a really, really important step. It's a first step, but it's an essential one, because the more of us that are talking about it, the more people will at least begin thinking about it. One of the encouraging things I find in the press, even in the financial press, is that degrowth ideas are being attacked by the financial sector. And I take that as a compliment that it merits attention.
Yeah.
And so we have to respond to those attacks, and we have to keep raising the issues, with our friends, with our families, in our workplaces, in our communities, in our clubs, in our associations. Same as with climate change. It's sometimes a hard conversation to have even with family members. But, finding a way of broaching some of these issues and getting people to think about what's really important and help them understand the urgency of making these changes, because if we don't plan for it, it's coming anyway. And that's the scary part. It's not the adverse things that are going to happen, but it's the lack of working together to plan for it that I think would make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I have a question from Claire Fanning that she has no microphone, and she asks that she would love to hear more on green growth and how we can swing from electrify everything as an answer to climate change to more simple and appropriate technologies choices. Any practical steps towards this collective shift?
You want to go, Sahra?
Yeah, well, I think that the challenge is enormous, and that as much as we can, simplifying, so reducing our requirements for energy, and really I've come to think about the climate crisis as an overconsumption crisis, really. So it may be that if people can, having solar panels is great, but it will mean using less as well. And sharing resources, and thinking about how that sense of the simplifying of lifestyle is part of reducing the need for energy. I think that ultimately what Jack was talking about before in terms of basic human needs, it's really the reprioritization that seems to me the biggest change in our mindset, and shifting to thinking about what's really necessary. And and so that's how I think about the green growth issue.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm not sure I can answer it well in terms of having some really practical steps, but one particular step is simply to learn more about low-tech ways of doing things. And there's actually a magazine and a website called Low Tech Magazine, and it has some wonderful ideas and examples from the past when people's power, or with simple handmade tools, not power-driven tools, but hand tools, to make things easier to do, but still using human energy to power them, or animal power. Think of things that you can do to do what you have to do to meet your needs without having to use powered machines or tools. And again, the low tech magazine has some really interesting examples of how to do that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one more thing. Often when I come across these sort of impossible imaginations around, how do we really do this? Like, it just seems so, where do you start? I think about real life examples, and for me personally, I'm very privileged because I have life experience where when I was growing up, I left school when I was 14, and I went and I lived in an Amish community. And I know that may seem like a very extreme example, but this was one of the happiest communities that I've seen in my whole life, and they were living very simply. And I think that the future probably will look a lot more like that. And I also, in my career as a midwife, I've spent 18 years working in various communities, and I've spent a lot of time in the Pacific Islands doing voluntary work, and the communities in the Solomon Islands, these are villages, so it's not just remote kind of rural farming ideal sort of situations that we might picture with space and land and all of that, but they're quite high density sort of villages, and they're living again with a lot of solidarity and a community spirit. They're sharing and singing together, and just that sense of common experience, and their basic human needs are incredibly simple, as you can imagine. And in Vanuatu the same, and the Solomon Islands, and in Papua New Guinea where I was, it was even more extreme. So there are examples that we can look to, and I think as the future becomes more disruptive, these types of communities will find it easier to adapt than us, because we are so reliant on the complex systemic reality that we find ourselves in. And when we talk about climate, we often talk about this horrible sort of binary of mitigation versus adaptation. And what Jack has said to me, which I always like to remember, is that adaptation done well addresses both mitigation and adaptation. And so the simpler we live now, the more prepared we'll be for the future, and the less damage that we'll do. And of course, having structures in place so that people with little means, that's why the tiny house example is such an important one for me. It's, shelter and housing is a basic human need, and we're not doing very well presently. We've got a housing crisis. So, the more we can focus on those basic needs and really prioritizing to look after as many people as possible, as simply as possible, the better we'll be on. The better the future will be for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We have Juliet with a question. Please, Juliet. Hello, Juliet.
I am muted.
Yes, we hear you.
I'm just trying to get the video back, and I'm coattailing Juliet. So I'll introduce myself in a tick. I'm just trying to get the video back. Just let me try and do that. 10 seconds.
No rush. Don't stress.
Start the video. No stress. No stress.
Hang on.
Start the video.
Oh, yeah.
There you are. Hello.
Mario, ete whānau. I'm Shappy, known to a few of you, Jack and Joanna particularly, having worked with the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. And as a 76-year-old, I'm still working Kotiaki Tonga professionally with iwi in the top of the south. And some observations, but I want to make a primary moral point. And the primary moral point is we do not deserve the future. We need to take the blame for obliterating our fellow travellers. We need to be morally humble. We don't need to be anthropocentrically focused on this. We need to be looking at life at large. We've destroyed 98% of wild creatures. We need to take that on the chin. The first priority is no more extinctions. If we have to go first, we deserve to go. We are morally bankrupt as a species, and we need to have that as a beginning point, because if we don't, we're lying to ourselves. So I just make that as the opening statement. Okay. Secondly, I don't see any rangatahi here, and I'm thinking that's who's inheriting what we're leaving, our legacy, and to strategize the sharing and uptake of degrowth and a step in changed paradigm. They're the point of engagement fundamentally. The country at large can't be engaged because this country has just elected the converse governance to our immediate needs. And so we need to reach to the people who are most affected, and that's the emerging generation if we have a target. And from a sociological point of view, and I've had a deep involvement in social science, the hard money says that humans are reactive, not proactive inherently. And so really the change will be prompted by cataclysm. It won't be prompted by a proactive uptake and go forwardness of a governed group of Western people. We will have to take it on the chin before we move along. and just to draw back to your experience in the Pacific and with my work with Māoridom and looking at Māoridom under COVID and looking at Māoridom under parlous circumstances, Māoridom and their tikanga and their sense of community and whānau collectiveness is much more of a community able to cope with the ensuing issues than our own. And so Māoridom provide a good model, and I see hopefully the stresses and strains imposed by the government as it's emerging with its 100-day plan. My prayer is that it unifies Māoridom, and Māoridom, we can support Māoridom to help us lead us out of the shit.
Mm. And actually,
thank you very much.
I have like 5 things I want to say in response. First of all, the point that I always like to make with the degrowth presentations that I give here in Wellington are that basically degrowth is not new to Indigenous people in general, right? Living within natural limits is normal for Indigenous peoples, and the reverence for the wider web of life is normal. And so it's our civilization of, capitalism and patriarchy and colonization. Industrial civilization has colonized the world. And I agree with you that we don't deserve to continue going. We don't want sustainability of this exploitative culture. I agree with that. And I think that we do have, in terms of your point about proactive versus reactive, I do think that, the pandemic is an interesting example. And I think, as things get worse, we are in a position potentially where we will see what happens in other places and whether or not people are, smart enough to start planning and downshifting here, knowing that it's impossible to keep, this kind of growth and extractive culture going, is going to be really important. And I think that you're right about rangatahi and young people. And I have the privilege tomorrow. I do this, reasonably regularly, but just tomorrow I'm going to a upper school, a high school with 250 teenagers, and I'm talking about degrowth, and they, they're really frightened about the future, and they're much more flexible in their thinking in terms of what's meaningful and what they want for their lives, and so I gain a lot of encouragement and inspiration really from working with younger people. You're still on mute. I'm really interested in what you're saying. Just sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. I think now it's Adrian.
Just a moment, Jose. We were just going to have a response still.
No, I'll call it Chris.
Yeah. Let Shappy make a comment to Sarah's reply to Sarah. You're muted, Shappy.
Okay, you there? You got me? Yep.
Yes, you're back again.
Yeah. I'm thinking that your experience with the young people is indicative of the human condition. They are responding to a stress. They are responding to the anticipated, outcomes that we've handed over to them. So they're being reactive, but they're being intelligently reactive because it is an existential threat for them. We'll be gone. And so you're seeing a reactive response there. I've had a friend working in Rarotonga over the years, a leader in New Zealand's renewable energy and sustainability, who's passed now. But when he was over there in a village, as you suggest, a bundle of suits came from Sydney to guide these people on how they could develop. And they were living as a sustainable model. And the bottom line, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that we are in a post-sustainability world. A post-sustainability world. So every action, and this is inherently supportive of degrowth, but every action must be restorative. Every action must be restorative.
Absolutely, because it's not just climate change. If we have insect populations that are collapsing, what is that going to mean for food pollination? And I think that's where, for me, even though it feels very basic to this group, I'm sure, but to go back to that thing about overshoot and multiple planetary boundaries, we're still so focused on climate change as the immediate threat. But when you look at the entire interconnectedness of problems that we're overshooting on so many different levels, and the threats are becoming more more noticeable and more real. And I think that, you know, when you look at, you know, the response that Māoridom had to the Cyclone Gabriel, for instance, going to the marae, pulling together local food production, we have examples, we know what to do. It's actually just the sense of getting on and doing it, and people actually understanding that, you know, we actually need to prepare. It's the only way forward. Yeah. So Adrian, should we go to you?
Yeah, I more a comment than a question, but something I'm keenly aware of in my software development profession. But yes, I don't.
Excuse me, Adrian. It's I don't know if anyone else is having difficulty, but your sound is
Oh,
there's something.
how do I sound now?
Can you distance the microphone from yourself? Or put the volume down. Just put the volume down a little bit.
Okay. That's better?
Yes.
Yes.
And just speak
Okay.
slowly.
Yeah. Yeah, something I'm very aware of as a software developer is that so much of the work we're doing is done just because we need to earn a profit. And I think and I think that's an important piece to explore, an important piece to acknowledge that a lot of the work we're doing is busy work.
Absolutely. And we even have a name for that, Adrian. It's called bullshit jobs.
Yes, I've heard it, yes.
So much of our society is just based on production, and a lot of that production is not sensible or even really necessary.
Yeah.
That's why in Degrowth, we
yeah.
keep emphasizing the priorities that, you know,
Mm.
what are we using energy for?
Yeah. From my perspective, it's so often advertising, direct or indirect, and telling investors good stories.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian.
Have
There is
you got
anybody?
any response to that, Jack, to the bullshit job situation? What is your comment?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of jobs, even ones that can be quite interesting and challenging, but are nonetheless generating a lot of material throughput without really meeting anyone's basic needs other than, you know, the profit motive. And we know that, you know, I mean, I think at this point in the history of our civilization, the whole idea of profit is unsustainable because it means that additional funds are becoming available to make additional claims on natural resources.
Yeah.
We're already over consuming. So, you know, what we need to do, I think, in my view, is focus on businesses that provide for basic needs and that are operated to give people a fair, you know, wage, a living wage by all means. I mean, money can be a useful medium of exchange. You know, it's easier to go, you know, and get a dozen eggs and pay with money than having to bring a pig, you know, to exchange eggs. But debt-based money is, you know, it's one of the policy changes of trying to reduce, you know, the debt-based money systems. It just calls for expansion. So we need businesses that focus on meeting basic needs both material and non-material. Some of them are social needs, you know, in terms of deliberative democracy activities, in terms of social supports, in terms of education, and so on. Those are all important kinds of activities, but they don't have to generate profit to make claims on future resources and to give people unusual levels of political influence, which is what a lot of, you know, profit seeking is about. To get more profit, to get more influence, you know.
Thank you, Jack. There is a question from Don. Don, can you? Yes.
Yep. Again, I'm not sure it's a question so much as a comment. I mean, I've talked about some of these things with Shabby, and I would kind of agree with a lot of what Shabby says, although he takes perhaps a more desperate view than I do. That is that, I mean, with our last election that we had, Mr. Luxon kept talking about, well, what it's all about is the economy. And Mr. Hipkins sort of fell in line with that and said, yes, yes, and they all looked at the economy. But it seemed to me that what we needed to vote for was the ethical integrity of our country. And that goes back to the treaty and various other things that we seem to like to ignore. And the problem is that, I mean, the economy, what's the economy? There is no such thing as economy. It's an abstraction. What it represents is a lot of people trying to make a living. So that's first off. So we get back to the issue of people and relationships. And second thing is that economics actually has no ethics at all. There is no ethical system in ethics. It's all based, as people were saying, on profit and money, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I think, if you look at all the small groups, indigenous groups, and we're talking about islands, we're talking about Māori and how they responded in their own communities to the COVID, et cetera, et cetera. An aspect of all of those communities is they have an ethic. There's an ethic about how you behave together. And I'm not sure that in a capitalist global system, that is going to win through. This is where I think that in the end, nature is, we've got to be, our backs, you know, as Shabby was saying too, it's reactive. We react when our backs are against the wall. And to my mind, what is going to make a change is what nature is going to do with us. And I believe that we actually do have the capacity to adapt, which is what we're talking about. But I very much doubt that the current system that we have is actually set up to do that. And I agree totally that we have to consider what it is that Indigenous people, et cetera, they don't seem to, many of them haven't got this separateness, and we're terribly separated from nature, the wild, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sorry, I'm babbling now, but my sense of it somehow or other is it's not to do with economics or anything else. It's how are we going to develop some kind of ethic that I think Sarah talked about reverence. And that is surely an important thing. We don't have reverence. There's no bloody reverence around in the current situation. And somehow we're going to have to recover that.
Yeah.
I'm sure we can.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with you, Don. And I think that, you know, one thing many people don't realize is that economics is completely socially constructed. And really, the economy is about resource management, you know, if you think about the actual, you know, root of the word. So the argument for degrowth is that we need to abandon the ideology of the constant pursuit of economic growth as something that is good, desirable, necessary, and natural, because it is none of these things. And if we really want to stay within planetary limits that make sense, we need to change and transform the economy and how we organize our lives. So, you know, as Jack has said to me often, it's about working out a when to stop rule together based on parameters of sufficiency. And, you know, we have the examples of health and food as our, and shelter as our basic human needs. And it's about intergenerational justice and wealth redistribution, and ultimately about reestablishing our relationship to the living world and rebuilding a culture of care. And it's interesting to me that you mention ethics, because just recently I was at a presentation in Wellington, and we were talking about, you know, the political situation and lobbying and political capture by, you know, wealthy lobbyists. And I made that exact point. I said it's about ethics, actually, is what it comes down to, and that's the tragedy of it, really, is that we've lost that. But when we talk about, you know, the kind of culture of care, it's really what makes sense, and it feels really far away from the society that we live in.
Yeah, but if I could just add, I totally agree that part of the solution, I think, is to begin appreciating nature and what it is and what it does for us and for other creatures. You know, it's a unique phenomenon in the galaxy, and yet we take it for granted. It really is sacred, and treating it as such, I think, you know, is perhaps what we're here for. I'm not sure. But in terms of economic systems, ecological economics is a reconstruction of neoliberal economics, and conceptual reconstruction that has two when to stop rules. One is about the level of natural resource use to make sure it's within the limits of regeneration. And the other is in terms of when to stop levels of inequality and the unfair distribution of the benefits of economic activity. And just while I'm here, Ivan Johnson has raised an issue about being more precise about profit, because he says the opposite of profit is loss. And obviously we don't want to create losses, that nothing can function that way. But there's a third condition, and that is breaking even. You know, receiving enough fair exchange for the efforts that you put into a task and producing a good or providing a service that allows you to live a decent, you know, life and you know, save for your future and so on, but not in excess. That's the real issue.
Thank you, Jack. I think that Duncan, you have raised your hand. If you would like to ask a question.
Yeah, I think it's not fully formed, but I work for the energy sector under a parent company that's a multinational, and it's, you know, I've given a few internal discussions and talks and presentations on degrowth and had really good buy-in from my small corner of the world. I guess my question is around like the possibility for these enterprises to shift away from that shareholder primacy and the profit motive towards more collective ownership. Any examples that you can give of companies that have done this either by choice or by demand? I think like my assumption is that like public buyouts and like recapturing energy companies for public good is like probably one of the biggest mechanisms there. But I don't know, I'm just looking for like examples where it's like a glimmer of hope to ride on and keep fighting the fight, I guess. But yeah.
Totally. I'm with you, Duncan. I was in a very similar situation recently, and one of the events that I mentioned that we had in Wellington recently was a film screening of a very, very new film called Outgrow the System. And the second half of that film is actually sort of case studies of social enterprises and not-for-profit organizations that are, you know, looking at working for social benefit, not profit. And it was really helpful for me to actually get those precise examples, because I think in the business world it's really hard to talk about this stuff, you know. And Jack has more of a expertise in this area. What would you say, Jack?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking of a local example here in the top of the South, Tui Balm, which is made by Tui Community. You know, it's a community-owned operation. It employs, I think, between 1 and 2 dozen people in the community, you know, and providing them with a bit of income. Nobody's getting rich on it, but it's providing a useful service, and people, you know, make good use of it. Well, and it provides income for the community, yeah, as well. Yeah. Yeah, and there are growing examples, but it's one thing that I think is very important even to look at for those kinds of cooperatives is what they're doing. It's not just how things are done, but what is being done, and is the good or service really meeting a basic need? Given that we have limited resources, limited demands we need to be making on nature, we need to make sure whatever demands we're making, whatever business activities we're engaged in, is actually doing something that's really important, not just making money. That I think is a key. You know, I lectured in sustainable business and MBA programs in Canada for a number of years, and it was all about how things were made, you know, to do it, you know, with less material or less energy or less toxic materials, but very little consideration of what was being produced in the first place. And I came to the conclusion that was a really important aspect in terms of actually reducing, you know, demands on nature.
Thank you, Jack. I would like to ask if there is any other participant to have any question, because we just have time for a couple of questions. So if somebody that has not spoken but has a question in their mind, would you like to raise your hand?
Well, people are doing that. There's a question in the chat about the donut economy, about whether it's a degrowth or green growth movement. And I would suggest that it's both. that aspects of it are green growth and aspects of it are degrowth. Many of the original ideas stem from ecological economics, actually. And ecological economics is very definitely a degrowth position. But Kate Rayworth has decided to publicly state that she's agnostic about growth, even though the way she talks about a lot of things, one gets the impression she's a degrowther at heart. But she'll need to clarify that herself. But I'd also like to add, you know, that we haven't talked a lot about climate change, and I really want to emphasize, you know, because it's such while it's still a difficult issue that many people still don't get it, many people have gotten it. Many people understand that we need to deal with climate change as a very serious existential threat. But the way that they've accepted the mainstream approach, which is electrifying everything, basically, rather than reducing material throughput. And I think it's a really important distinction, and I would encourage all of you who are concerned about climate to remain concerned about climate, but to think hard about how to reduce material throughput as and focusing on universal basic needs at a community level as ways of dealing with both mitigation and adaptation, as opposed to just continuing the way we're going, and to challenge, you know, government's responses about, I mean, this government wants to build more EV charging stations. Well, that's more material throughput when we should be reducing the demand for transport. You know, in the same way we need to reduce the demand for milk products, much of which goes to making milk powder, which goes to making confections in junk food. You know, it's not even food can be used not to satisfy basic needs. So we really have to think hard about basic needs and material throughput to deal with a whole range of these existential threats, of which climate's only one.
Okay, we just have time for the last question, I think. Chappie, you raise your hand, so we just have 5 minutes before we close. So please, Chappie, your time.
Okay, have you got my voice? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So immediately the term profit was raised, and it's so important that we get our language right and help socialize by using informed terminology. So immediately the word profit was raised, people thought economy. The most offensive thing is the non-for-profit organization legal structure, because it's the profits, they're the profits we want. The non-profit organizations are actually the survival profits, the profits that are supporting communities and other needs that aren't being supported by social infrastructure. So where I'm going is, what are true profits? It's not money. And we agree that it's an artifice. We need to repurpose the term profit. The term profit is making positive contributions to the health of the planet, which includes all the species on it. So I just leave you with that thought. And then I turn to Patanjali, 200 AD, Hindu prophet. And then I turn to Ernst Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, who's put up a proposition in front of us called right livelihood. And in his terms, he calls it Buddhist economics. And that means that we only society only empowers work, employed work, that contributes. And so if I was in charge, for instance, I would be taxing cigarettes and Coca-Cola and cars out of existence, and I would be putting all those taxes into the profit-making side of things, which is where the non-profit organizations nest. So conceptual thinking around profit, let's not have that stolen by the economic idiots. Let's purpose profit positively and describe it that way in our rhetoric. It's so important. And so if we have right livelihood, it means when we go to work, we're contributing, but it's contributing to us because we're morally satisfied because we're making a contribution. And in our normal day-to-day right living, we need to be in a total overall parallel. Right living coupled with right livelihood means restorative action. And Joanna knows this because I've saturated Joanna with word constructs over time. It's important that as we transition into a new place, we transition the messages, because the socialization is locked into the messages, like us assuming immediately that profit, which is just a generic positive outcome, is interpreted into the economic space. I confront you over that, and I challenge you to think differently. Pomarie.
Dora, thank you. And I also think that the word poverty is also something to think about. You know, we're in a culture where there's a poverty of meaning and a poverty of connection and a poverty of reverence. So I think really starting to think about what is meaningful, and you're raising that in our use of language, I think is incredibly important. And again, I would say that I have been very inspired by many of the young people that I'm talking to who are very disillusioned with the system as it is. And they're thinking much more widely in terms of what really is meaningful and what is satisfying, and what is it that we want to preserve and sustain. So thank you.
Yeah. Can I just make a last comment, and that is, if anyone present is interested in working at their community level to try to develop resilient community based on meeting everyone's basic needs from a degrowth perspective, get in touch with Sahra or I, because we're working on this project, and we'd love your involvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Oh,
you're muted, Jose.
Sorry. Thank you to our speakers. It has been really very, very interesting. And to all the people that has attended the seminar. You can go to the website of Degrowth, Aotearoa.org, and get more information. And I would like to pass the microphone now to Joanna and close this wonderful seminar with a karakia.
Thank you, Jose. This karakia is one that's set at the end of a waka journey where we've been paddling together and we've reached the shore. Ko te hā, ko te pō, ko tangaroa, ko te mana, ko te kotahitanga o ngā mātāwaka. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e.
Taiki e.
Kia ora, Joanna.